Hey everyone, I'm Jesse Fletcher. I'll be giving the second part of the Urban Animals presentation, where I'll be talking about what features of urban habitats encourage different organisms to come in and inhabit those areas, as well as this field called reconciliation ecology, which Caitlin actually brought up in her video, and I'll get into it more depth. So, what attracts species to urban habitats? Jared is going to cover this in his video. That's the fourth part of this in a lot of detail, so I'll just go over the very basics. Food, warmth, and space. High concentrations of specific prey species in these habitats can be a good food source for certain organisms to come in and take advantage of that. Heat island effect, where cities are at more constant temperatures from day to night. The warmer temperatures can be attractive to species who like that feature and find themselves more comfortable in a constant temperature environment. And disturbance of the urbanization leaves room for new organisms to take advantage of the changing habitat. So basically, this new kind of unoccupied space that a city introduces, occupied by people, but unoccupied in terms of it kind of clears off a lot of the existing food webs and interactions, can be beneficial for organisms that want to come in and kind of build their own new food webs. And part of this is protection from predation. So the city, maybe a predator that was, there in the pre-existing natural habitat will be kicked out by the city. And that leaves room for new organisms that maybe were more of a prey species to now come in and dominate or take advantage of that empty space. Finally, cities act as cultural hubs when it comes to people coming in and out, maybe for trade or just entertainment, that sort of thing. New Orleans, for example, right on the Mississippi River, there are a lot of boats coming in and out, and that can also bring along with that new species, which kind of just attach themselves to those boats, or maybe fish that hop on and they're living inside the boat. For example, the Australian spotted jelly is now in the Gulf of Mexico. This is an invasive species that was brought from waters around Australia, and it consumes a lot of the smaller organisms that are also consumed by fish who are native to these waters in the Gulf of Mexico. And that impacts the success of fisheries around Louisiana and that just around that region in general. So that's kind of close to home when it comes to New Orleans. Now, reconciliation ecology, this is a field that I just brought up. I found this definition, I think is pretty good. The modification and diversification of anthropogenic habitats to support a greater range of species without compromising the land use. So this focuses on the anthropogenic habitat, like an urban environment, having people come in and make their own influences and build their own structures, but then still have the pre-existing species, remain. And that brings in richness and biodiversity. This diversification will allow a lot more people to interact with nature. 52.9% of humanity is in urbanized environments these days, or at least since 2015. The number is currently rising. So that means more people will be able to interact with, the natural world and having the different species come in to cities and other urbanized environments. And then this allows a native species who were there already before the city came in or before the urban habitat came in to repopulate and not be totally forgotten in that area, but be able to still live along with the humans. And this is different from preservation and restoration ecology. Preservation and restoration, that focuses on having the pre-existing ecosystem stay exactly the way it was without human influence, whereas reconciliation ecology does want, it looks at how humans can come in and change the environment, but then still have, change the environment as we naturally do, but still have the pre-existing native species be able to survive and stick around. This is very important when it comes to combating extinction cascades, climate crises. Recent studies have revealed that preservation and restoration ecology alone won't be able to protect certain species from, just dropping off the face of the earth. And it also won't be able to protect the world from climate change. So we really need reconciliation ecology and other fields that can, bring new perspectives of how we can live with the organisms as opposed to just kicking them out of cities. So there are two approaches to this that are overarching. There are certainly more, but these are the two that I'm going to go into, top-down and bottom-up approaches. So yeah, these both, they apply to reconciliation ecology. Top-down techniques, they're executed by politicians, urban planners, landscape engineers, anybody with a high influence who can make these large-scale changes. Usually these changes, the benefit is that they're a lot more clear, they're efficient, they have a very well thought out structure, and they're very organized. But then they also do require a lot of public input to make sure that the changes that are being made are supported by the public and are positively allowing them to interact with the natural world. And it also definitely requires input from experts, scientists, sociologists, who can look at the changes before they're made, just look at the plans and confirm that they will benefit species richness in the area. They'll bring biodiversity, and they won't have, too many unexpected negative consequences when it comes to, possibly even, these negative consequences could counteract the efforts that are being made to bring in new organisms by kind of ruining other relationships between organisms and then kicking some out in the process. Two examples of this, public parks and gardens, such as in New Orleans, we have City Park. This is a picture right here. And Tulane University right here, the campus, it's also covered in greenery. So these are two large-scale efforts that have been made, definitely thought out by designers and ecologists and people who want to make sure that these areas can bring richness and biodiversity into a city, that being New Orleans. And then also City Park, Caitlin talked about talked about alligators in City Park in her video. So that's just an example clearly of how this is bringing positive changes. You have people interacting with alligators, a natural, like a native species, to the New Orleans area, but then also there are people, like the city, or like the park, coordinators and the police making sure that it doesn't become like a dangerous interaction. Finally, bottom-up approaches. These are carried out on the individual level by, people or families. They're like small-scale efforts that in the end have a large-scale impact when they're done by many people. And they allow individuals to develop a relationship with the natural world. So by enacting these small-scale efforts themselves, people feel like they are making a change, and this allows them to feel more connected to nature. And in general, it makes it makes people more considerate when it comes to the natural world. Two examples of this are living roofs and walls and pollinator gardens. So right here, this is a living surface. It's a living roof. You see the grass. It's been planted on top of the house. So basically, people, the people living here want, by planting this grass, they're trying to bring in native species and other species to live, right on their house and kind of bring more of the natural world, into their home. This can definitely encourage plants and vertebrates to populate this area or areas like it. And then another side effect is it can actually bring in unexpected, like non-traditional forms of biodiversity that can be a good or a bad thing. I'll get into the bad side later, like with invasive species in a second. But it can definitely be a good thing when it comes to just bringing non-native species to also live there, because like there are definitely non-native species that aren't harmful to the ecosystem in the long run. And then pollinator gardens, this is where people grow native plants and bushes right in their yards and their gardens. You can plant native flowers, and this attracts birds, bats, insects, other pollinators that come in, and it specifically focuses on bringing in native species to pollinate these flowers and these plants. And then also that brings in the species that interact with those pollinators. So it's just in general encouraging native species to stick around in people's gardens. All right, finally, I talked about here how it can be a bad thing to have non-traditional life forms, and this is just going to highlight that. 3 examples of invasive species in New Orleans. So we have the water hyacinth. This is a species that Professor Taylor brought up in a previous class, which was introduced to New Orleans for the 1884 World Fair as like a aesthetic kind of thing, because it definitely does look pretty. or many people would find it pretty, when it's just, a controlled, example of the plants. But then when it's not controlled, they can form big mats that kind of like cover up the surfaces of water bodies. And these mats reproduce extremely quickly, so they can double in size in 1 to 2 weeks. And then overall, the negative, consequences of this, they clog up the water bodies, cover them up so that light can't come in, and they diminish oxygen levels coming in from the air. So just in general, limiting the resources to the organisms down below in the water. Alligator weed is very similar to water hyacinth. This is a photo of it right here. It also forms these mats over calm water bodies. And the roots underneath in the water get all tangled up. And this will sort of impede the water circulation below and also stop the organisms down below from moving around freely. This can stop predators from consuming their prey, as they used to in the more, before the species was introduced. So yeah, overall, that can definitely lead to negative consequences. And also people trying to navigate the waters up top in their boats. The boat, maybe if they're on a swamp and it's covered in this plant, the boat will get all caught up, and somebody will have to actually come in and rescue the person who's just trying to get across. So yeah, definitely negative consequences with that. And then nutria, finally, it's the last organism that I'll cover, was introduced to New Orleans in the 1930s. It's originally from South America, this little rodent-looking guy right here. And they were sought after and brought to New Orleans for the fur industry, because people can take their fur and put that into clothing. And then also for weed control. So basically looking at, organisms like this that become invasive, these plants, they're actually a good food source for the nutria. So the nutria can come in and consume these weeds that are kind of becoming invasive and try and make that less of a problem when implemented in like a restricted, more like organized manner by people. But then, unfortunately, as all animals do, they escape captivity, got loose, maybe, they started reproducing in the New Orleans area, and then they consume just so many of these plants, other plants, because their diets are very wide. So then in that way, they kind of limited the food resources for other organisms, ruined pre-existing food webs. And then also a huge negative side effect is that a lot of the plants that it did consume after getting loose, the roots that they had in the soil, that was actually stabilizing the soil and stabilizing the ground. So then once those are consumed, the roots die off, the plant no longer stabilizes the soil. This can lead to destruction of the coastal wetland kind of region in general, as the ground begins to crumble and destabilize underneath. So yeah, that has led to a lot of the land loss that New Orleans is now experiencing, and that Louisiana in general is now experiencing. So yeah, those are the 3 that I'm covering, and this is the last slide. So there's my presentation. Thank you for listening, and hopefully that'll allow y'all to kind of consider more the importance of bringing species in to the urban habitat, encouraging their incorporation into like human life, so that we can coexist, but then also not bringing in invasive species, other organisms that are going to kind of ruin the pre-existing, food webs that we're trying to preserve. So yeah, thank you. And now head over to Sarah's video, number 3, where she'll talk about pigeons as a case study for urban environments. All right.